Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So, been a little busy lately trying to get some stuff done around the house, so I haven't had a chance to do this as often as I would like. Yesterday I spent several hours on a fruitless search for um, molding that matched what I already had in the bedroom, and no luck. So I wasted a lot of time that I had intended to use to make this episode yesterday, and I've been intending to make it for a while. But anyway, uh, what I want to talk about today is the controversy that's emerged about Anthony Fauci's emails, where just recently, through a Freedom of Information Act request, uh, or two separate requests, BuzzFeed as well as the Washington Post, uh, were able to obtain copies of total of thousands of pages of Anthony Fauci's emails and emails from other people to him during the early stages of the pandemic back between uh, January and April of 2020. And a lot of people have accused Fauci of lying about a number of things early on in the pandemic. And some of those people have been left and independent commentators on YouTube and elsewhere, such as Jimmy Dore and Jackson Hinkle, Jordan Chariton, and his colleague Jen Dice from Status Coup, populist, center-right independent commentator Sagar and Jetty from Rising, and more recently the Breaking Points independent podcast that he and Crystal Ball have started. And I think that they've missed some things here because they haven't looked at this in as much depth as they should have. And basically, the main point I want to make today, and we'll take a close look at these actual emails and the context surrounding them, and you can judge for yourself. What most of them, an exception being Jen Dice from Status Quo, have missed is that scientific opinion evolves as new evidence comes along. And much of what folks have latched onto in these emails as supposedly being proof of Fauci lying about various things. And I'm not saying Fauci hasn't ever lied about anything, but in this case, the supposed proof in these emails obtained by the Post and the BuzzFeed, neither of whom claimed that Fauci was lying, by the way, in their articles about this. But basically, what happened is that Fauci, as well as the CDC, as well as the World Health Organization, as well as scientists outside of government, in a lot of cases, changed their opinions as scientific evidence came along, rather than anybody deliberately deceiving anybody. And I will say, and we'll talk about this in detail, that Fauci is indeed guilty of not mentioning some things that he should have early on. And he's also guilty of poorly explaining some things about government policy and its motivation. And, I do think it was wrong for him and for others among American scientists who did so to publicly discourage mask wearing early on. But, as I'm going to show you, to elaborate a bit, Fauci is one of many American scientists, both inside and outside of government, who got things very wrong about the efficacy of masks, other than N95 masks, the most protective masks that people actually working with known COVID patients, for example, where they were wrong about the efficacy of masks other than N95 masks for protecting the wearer. They didn't think that masks in general were very effective at protecting the person who was wearing them from infection, as opposed to preventing the spread of the disease to others, from the wearer to others. They didn't really understand adequately masks' importance in slowing community spread of diseases. And they didn't understand how prevalent asymptomatic transmission of COVID was. Now, as some of these commentators pointed out, they were aware that there was asymptomatic transmission early on, but as we'll see, they weren't aware of how common it is. Now, to their credit, there are many scientists and some governments in some countries in the world, such as China, for example. I believe the Czech Republic is another example, New Zealand, etc. They got masks right very early on. Very early on, they implemented mask mandates, or everybody was just wearing masks, and that's one reason why, at least early on, because the Czech Republic obviously changed a lot in that regard. They had much lower rates of COVID than countries that were late to the game in terms of implementing some sort of policy of encouraging or mandating that people wear masks in public indoor settings. Those countries that got it right were the exception to the rule. And what Fauci and other American scientists and public health bureaucrats were saying about masks early on, where they were discouraging members of the general public from wearing masks to prevent the spread of COVID, it was a result of not having the requisite scientific data about masks and about COVID transmission. It wasn't an attempt to mislead the public, as some commentators have claimed. So let me just, I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to show you part of one of the YouTube episodes that I'm referring to, and I'll talk some about the others. So let's take a look at Jackson Hinkle of the Dive podcast had to say about Fauci's emails, and it contains clips about Fauci speaking about these issues. So let's take a look at that, and then we'll talk some more. Okay, come on. Oops.
Dr. Fauci has had thousands of his emails made public. And this is overall, I think it's a good thing, because we are able to see a lot of what's been going on behind the scenes. And one of the emails that was recently released that caused a whole shit ton of criticism were some emails surrounding Dr. Fauci's comments on masks and the mask mandates, and when the CDC was and the federal government was recommending that people start wearing masks. And he actually addressed some of these emails and the concerns brought forward surrounding them on CNN just the other day. So I want to play this clip for you, because some of you might remember another clip that went viral earlier on in the pandemic, when Fauci said, the reason why we told everyone not to wear masks at the start of the pandemic was because, we had low supply of PPE, of masks in particular, and we wanted to make sure that our first responders, people who are actually treating people who are COVID infected, had the ability to secure that PPE, secure masks, have enough masks for them to make sure that we didn't run out of masks for the people who are actually preventing this from spreading further and further, right? So it was a noble lie that he put
forward
back then. He admitted to the fact that, we lied about this because we...
Jesus. Okay, sorry. Just to you point out here that you're preserving masks for healthcare providers who had direct contact with COVID patients was not the only reason by any means why Fauci, and not just Fauci, but public health officials across the board, including the World Health Organization, were not advising people to wear masks, and in fact, in Fauci's case and some others, discouraging mask wearing by the general public. That there were other reasons why they did that as well, and that made clear that it wasn't because they were deliberately lying about masks. So we'll get into that in a few minutes.
Wanted to make sure our first responders had access to the masks when they were in short supply. And then once they were no longer in short supply, we told everyone, wear a mask. It's important you wear a mask. He's now lying about that lie and claiming that, that's not actually why they said that. And he did so in this CNN interview when he was, asked about the criticisms that are being brought forward against him surrounding these emails being made public. So take a look at what he has to say here. Then we'll go back and watch the first noble lie he did surrounding the mask question, because when you play these two clips back to back, it shows just how ridiculous he sounds, and it really calls into question his own integrity and whether or not we can trust someone like Dr. Fauci. So take a look at this clip, and then we'll come back and watch the second one after.
Well, John, let's get real here. If you look at scientific information as it accumulates, what is going on in January and February, what you know as a fact, as data, guides what you tell people and your policies. If March, April, May occur, you accumulate a lot more information and you modify and adjust your opinion and your recommendation based on the current science and current data. So of course, if we knew back then that a substantial amount of transmission was asymptomatic people, if we knew then that the data show that masks outside of a hospital setting are actually do work when we didn't know it then, if we realized all of those things back then, of course, you're asking a question.
I just want to interject there. This is an example of Fauci not making himself very clear. When he said we didn't know that masks worked outside of the hospital, I mean, on its face, that comment makes absolutely no sense, right? As several commentators have correctly pointed out, because obviously a given mask is going to have the same efficacy regardless of where you wear it. But what I'm guessing, given the context that he meant, and just explained himself very poorly, was that they knew back then that N95 masks worked very well in preventing infected people from spreading diseases and in protecting them from getting infected by COVID patients, in this case, doctors and nurses and so forth, working with COVID patients. But we didn't know about the efficacy of, for example, cloth masks worn by members of the general public in settings where they're not directly coming into contact on a daily basis with people they know have COVID. At that time, they didn't know whether that would really do any good as far as protecting the wearer. And we'll get into this in a little more detail. Anyway,
would you have done something different if you know what you know now? Of course people would have done that. That's so obvious.
So let's go.
So that's a really, really interesting comment from Fauci there. The reason why I find that so interesting is because he said, if we knew that masks were effective outside of a hospital setting at the start of the pandemic, of course we would have encouraged everyone to wear a mask, right? I mean, it would have been a no-brainer. That's what he had to say surrounding these emails being brought forward about criticisms of when he was telling people to wear masks and when he wasn't telling people to wear masks. What I don't understand is, why does Fauci expect us to believe, like, full stop, that masks are only effective in a hospital setting, but they're not effective when you're at work, or they're not effective when you're in a school, or they're not effective, when you're in a nursing home, or they're not effective when, wherever you are in another enclosed building. Like, why does he expect us to believe that there was science that pointed to the fact that there was only evidence to prove that masks were effective in a hospital, but not anywhere else indoors, and not anywhere else outdoors for that matter? Like, it just makes zero sense. But it doesn't have to make sense, because we already know this to be true. We know that Fauci understood this at the time, and the real reason why he wasn't encouraging everyone to wear masks, and why he actually told people that you don't have to wear a mask, was because he knew that PPE was on short supply, and he wanted to be able to make sure that first responders, people who are treating COVID patients, had the ability to secure PPE before it ran out. So take a look at this clip and just compare it for yourself. He's giving a noble lie here. He's explaining his noble lie that they were trying to secure PPE for the people who were most at risk of contracting COVID, and that's why they told people not to wear masks outside the hospital setting. But in that last clip, he's like, if the science had told us at the time that people should be wearing masks, then of course we would have done it. Take a look at the second clip. It just goes to show, like, how much of a fraud he really is.
Getting back to your first question, which was, what about a month or so, or 2 or 3 ago, when people were saying you don't really need to wear a mask? Well, the reason for that is that we were concerned, the public health community, and many people were saying this, were concerned that it was at a time when personal protective equipment, including the N95 masks and the surgical masks, were in very short supply. And we wanted to make sure that the people, namely the healthcare workers, who were brave enough to put themselves in harm's way to take care of people who were infected with the coronavirus, and the danger of them getting infected, we did not want them to be without the equipment that they needed. So there was not enthusiasm about going out and everybody buying a mask or getting a mask. We were afraid that that would deter away from the people who really needed it. Now,
so there you go, folks. There you go. I mean, that's Fauci admitting, plain and simple, that, look, we told people back then, in that clip that I just showed you, that's the older clip. That's him admitting that, like, yeah, well, we told people not to wear masks because we wanted to make sure that our short supply PPE was available to be used for people who are most at risk of contracting COVID. The second clip I just showed you.
Okay, and that's not all he said there. Jackson cut off the clip, which, I mean, I don't think he was trying to mislead anybody about what Fauci said. But, I mean, if you listen to the whole interview, he says other things about why they told people not to wear masks, which are consistent with what he said in the other interview. So I'm just looking through this, see if there's anything else. Okay. So one thing that I'd like to point out, and I'll try to point this out to Jackson as well, is that he claimed that Fauci lied about masks and that the emails proved that, and then he didn't even show any of Fauci's emails, which seems kind of strange. And I'll get to the content of those emails in a little while. But I just wanted to move on to talking about some other commentary that people have made. So, let's see. So Sagar and Jetty claimed that Fauci's emails revealed lies about the lab leak hypothesis. And as I said, in the interest of time, I'm not going to show you that or other clips. I'll definitely put a link to them in the description. And so what Sagar and Jetty, the sort of center-right populist commentator who was Crystal Ball's co-host with the Rising podcast on the Hill, and now they have an independent show called Breaking Points. But what he's referring to in terms of claiming that Fauci lied is that there was an email sent to Fauci on January 31st, 2020, where a scientist who emailed Dr. Fauci, and what's his name? It'll probably come to me eventually. But actually, I think I have it. Christian Anderson. So this is the main email that Sagar's referring to here. Christian Anderson emailed Fauci saying, "Hi Tony, thanks for sharing the article about the possible origins of COVID. Yes, I saw this earlier today, and both Eddie and myself are actually quoted in it. It's a great article, but the problem is that our phylogenetic analyses aren't able to answer whether the sequences are unusual at individual residues, except if they are completely off. On a phylogenetic tree, the virus looks totally normal, and the close clustering with bats suggests that bats serve as a reservoir." So he's saying, in other words, that likely there was the origin of COVID was a jump from animals to humans, and bats were either the direct route of transmission to humans, or they were where the virus originally came from, and then it jumped to an intermediate species and then to humans. He goes on to say, "The unusual features of the virus make up a really small part of the genome." So, geez, I'm not showing you this. I'm sorry. Let me see if I can... Oh, sorry about that. Okay, I'm going to quickly... how can I... Never mind, I'm just going to read it to you because that'll take too long. So Anderson goes on to say, "The unusual features of the virus make up a really small part of the genome, less than 1.1%. So one has to look really closely at all the sequences to see that some of the features potentially look engineered." So in other words, he's saying there's a really tiny part of the virus that might possibly have been genetically engineered. In other words, manufactured in a lab, and the virus leaked from the lab. So he's just saying that seems like it could be a possibility upon first glance. We have a good team lined up to look very critically at this, so we should know much more at the end of the weekend. I should mention that after discussions earlier today, Eddie, Bob, Mike, and myself all find the genome inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory. But we have to look at this much more closely, and there are still further analyses to be done. So those opinions could still change. So this email was sent on Friday, January 31st, and he's saying, we'll be able to look more closely at the virus and have more empirically grounded conclusions by Sunday night or something, by the end of the weekend. So what Sagar said about all this was that this scientist, Christian Anderson, was saying that they thought it was likely that the virus originated in a lab through genetic engineering. And then Sagar goes on to say in his segment that they then dramatically changed their opinion and or changed what they said rather in public, producing an opinion piece in a scientific journal. I believe it was in Nature. That said that the virus is of natural origin. The lab leak hypothesis isn't credible. So Sagar claims in his segment that there was a cover-up of the lab leak hypothesis of scientists thinking that it was plausible if not likely, involving scientists as well as the mainstream media who are out to get Trump. Now, he doesn't, certainly, no doubt, the mainstream media, while Trump was in office, did everything they could to try and discredit Trump. Although at the same time, it's definitely the case that Trump pushed a lot of conspiracy theories. As you may recall, he was the originator of the conspiracy theory that Barack Obama was born in Kenya. And, he also lied a lot. And just as is happening today, there was certainly an effort during the Trump administration to manufacture negative public opinion about China, which pushing this lab leak theory, the evil Chinese engineered COVID in a lab and then either accidentally or deliberately leaked it out. That was part of the propaganda campaign by the Trump administration and others to try and stoke Cold War hysteria and hostility toward China. And this is a topic that I'll definitely be doing an episode on at some point. But Sagar's claiming that Fauci, somehow these emails are a smoking gun that Fauci, and other scientists were covering up the viability of the lab leak hypothesis. But Sagar has no fucking clue of what he's talking about, to put it bluntly. He clearly doesn't understand the context of this email that I read to you, where Anderson was expressing an opinion that the virus could have been engineered before he and his colleagues had done any research on it. They had just looked at it and they were like, this looks suspicious. Let's look into it further. We can do I'm not a virologist, so I don't know how long it takes, but he said, we'll know more by the end of the weekend, within a couple of days. And so, they did look into it, and you did a study. And that opinion piece that they published in March was not just an opinion piece, it was a peer-reviewed research paper. What Sagar doesn't understand is that there are certain scientific journals that publish what they call letters to the editor that are not opinion pieces, but they're very short scientific papers based on scientific evidence that the researchers who are writing the letter have obtained. And so what they said in this piece was that, we've studied SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus that causes COVID, and we have, through our research, obtained evidence that it's exceedingly unlikely that this virus could have been engineered in a lab, and it's much more plausible that it originated from animals. And that's what the scientific community in general, who had relevant scientific expertise, was saying. So Sagar claims that the January 31st email by one scientist, it was just from one scientist. He claimed that this reveals that scientists disregarded their own findings. And that's just patently false, Sagar. There weren't any findings on January 31st to disregard. Now I'll be discussing this particular topic, of the origins of COVID, and how the media has covered it over time, especially recently, in a subsequent episode. But back to Fauci's emails. Sorry, I'm just kind of clicking on the episodes as I go along. So Jimmy Dore says, more Fauci lies exposed in emails. So again, I'm in the interest of time, I'm just going to summarize what Jimmy said. Jimmy claims they got him in reference to BuzzFeed's Freedom of Information Act request for Fauci's emails. It resulted in their receiving over 3,000 pages of them, implying, as he went on to claim, that they caught Fauci lying about masks and about what was known about asymptomatic transmission. But again, as I mentioned earlier, the BuzzFeed article that Jimmy is referring to about the emails that they obtained through a FOIA request, as well as the Washington Post article about the trove of emails that they obtained as a result of to and from Fauci that they obtained in their FOIA requests. Neither of them claimed that Fauci lied about anything. That was Jimmy's inference, not theirs. And then there was an episode titled "Anthony Fauci Has Some Explaining to Do" on Status Coup, Jordan Chariton and Jen Dice's channel, where Jordan at least claimed that Fauci was lying in his emails. And, out of the coverage of Fauci emails by left or independent media that I've watched or read, in my opinion, this was the best that I came across, although, I thought it was still flawed in some ways. So Jordan accused Fauci of lying, but in his comments about masks, but he never really backed up that claim. But what I did like about that episode is that Jen, his co-host, pointed out that the reason that Fauci's and the CDC's position on masks changed is arguably because they became aware of new evidence about the efficacy of masks, including, in particular, non-N95 masks, or cloth masks, which there was never any shortage of, obviously. Their efficacy for protecting the wearer was documented in later research that was not available when, in February and March, when the CDC and Fauci and everybody was discouraging people from, in the general public, from wearing masks. Not because they were out to deceive anybody at the beginning. And Jordan had, what I thought was a good point in response to this, that, although that is true, that evidence evolved as time went on. They did have the example at the time of other countries where mask wearing was common or actually mandated from very early on in the pandemic. That was the case in China, for example, and many other places. Although it was a minority. And Jordan said, what they should have said was, okay, we don't have enough evidence to make a firm recommendation, pro or con, about people, for example, making homemade masks and wearing them. We don't really know enough to say whether or not this will protect the wearer or protect other people from getting COVID if they have it. Rather than making some sort of definitive statement that people shouldn't be wearing masks. I think that's a fair point. I think that, despite not being fully aware of all the relevant issues of this, not having adequate scientific data to make accurate recommendations, they shouldn't have firmly recommended against masks. But okay, I've been talking about these emails, but I wanted to actually show them to you. Okay, and now I know that these fact check sites, are not necessarily always reliable, because they're mostly run by Democratic-friendly media or websites, and so they definitely go out of their way to bash Trump or other Republicans, in ways that aren't always solid. But in this case, they actually looked at Fauci's emails and the context surrounding them. Fact check missing context and claim about emails and Fauci's position on masks. So the claim, which was made by several commentators commentators that I mentioned to you, is that an email from Dr. Fauci proves that he knew masks were ineffective at mitigating the spread of COVID-19. I'm sorry, that isn't what people are saying. What other people have claimed is that the email in question proved that he knew that masks were effective, but was deliberately lying in order to preserve them for healthcare officials. But if we look at his email on February 5th, we can see that that's not the case. And we can also see that it's not true that he knew masks were ineffective, because that's not what he thought. So Fauci received an email on February 5th, 2020 from a colleague asking him whether he thought that she should bring a mask with her when she traveled. And Fauci's response was, masks are really for infected people to prevent them from spreading infection to people who are not infected, rather than protecting uninfected people from acquiring infection. The typical mask you buy in the drugstore, i.e. not an N95 mask, is not really effective in keeping out virus, which is small enough to pass through the material. Okay, well that right there, what he just said is you misinformed, because he should have known. I think I even knew that back then, that viruses don't just float around in the air by themselves. They travel in the air, enclosed in droplets of water vapor. And depending on the size of the droplets, if they're bigger, they don't stay in the air very long, and then they quickly fall to the ground. Or if they're very tiny droplets, they can stay suspended in the air for quite some time, and that's why you've got documented cases of people getting infected with COVID in situations where they weren't directly exposed to other infected people, but it was an enclosed space with poor ventilation, and nobody was wearing a mask, and so these particles of water vapor were lingering in the air when people came in there and were there long enough to be exposed to a sufficient dose. For whatever reason, Fauci didn't know that. And he went on to say that he would not recommend the person who was writing to him wear a mask during travel to a very low risk location. So that's part of the missing context here, that people like Jimmy Dore and Jordan and so forth in the independent left media are overlooking, is that very early on in the pandemic, there was not widespread community transmission or spread of COVID. There were, I forget the exact figures. Let me see if I can find that real quickly. How much spread of COVID was there right at the very beginning? In the United States, for example. Oh, Jesus. So slow. Okay, so let's look here at early on in the pandemic, there were just a few hundred known cases of COVID in the entire United States. So there wasn't much testing then. So let's say there were 10 times as many, so a few thousand cases of COVID in the entire United States. And that was the case in most countries in the world at that time, early in the pandemic, January, February, March. So most places that the general public went, there weren't too many people around who had COVID. So from that perspective, although it was the wrong advice, it's not wildly implausible advice to say, well, if you don't wear a mask, you're probably not going to get infected. And given what was known at the time, they also said, well, if it's not an N95, you, the wearer, are not very protected from infected people anyway. That's what they thought at the time. Responding to questions about the February 5th email during a June 3rd appearance on CNN, Fauci said his understanding changed as more information became available about asymptomatic transmission of the virus and the effectiveness of masks outside of hospitals, by which, again, I think he meant the effectiveness of masks that aren't super high quality, like N95s. If we realized all of those things back then, of course, you're asking the question, would you have done something different if you knew what you know now? Of course, people would have done that. That's so obvious. Okay, that's the quote that I gave you earlier. And again, bear in mind, Fauci was by no means the only public health official or doctor in general who was recommending against people in the general public wearing masks. So, for example, on February 9th, then U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Jerome Adams tweeted in all caps, people should stop buying masks. And he went on to say masks were ineffective and widespread use could lead to shortages. So, by that he meant masks other than N95 masks were ineffective at protecting the wearer. Then Fauci, in his famous interview on 60 Minutes on March 8th, said there's no reason to be walking around with a mask. And, if you go back, with the Wayback Machine, as Jen from Status Coup mentioned, and look at the CDC's guidance at that time, they were not recommending that the general public wear masks either. Also, the World Health Organization was not recommending that people wear a mask, other than if they themselves were infected or if they were a healthcare worker. This was actually on June 5th. The Director General of the World Health Organization, which I forget his name, said if it is absolutely necessary for a sick person or a contact to leave the house, they should wear a medical mask. WHO continues to advise that people caring for an infected person at home should wear a medical mask while they're in the same room as the sick person, and obviously the sick person should. And WHO continues to advise that healthcare workers use medical masks and other protective equipment when dealing with suspected or confirmed COVID-19 patients. Here's what's new, he said. In areas with widespread transmission, WHO advises medical masks for all people working in clinical areas of a health facility, not only workers dealing with patients with COVID. Second, in areas with community transmission, we advise that people aged 60 years or over, or those with underlying conditions, should wear a medical mask in situations where physical distancing is not possible. Third, WHO has also updated its guidance on the use of masks by the general public in areas with community transmission. In light of evolving evidence, WHO advises that government should encourage the general public to wear masks where there is widespread transmission and physical distancing is difficult, such as on public transport, in shops, or in other confined and crowded environments. Our updated guidance contains new information on the composition of fabric masks based on academic research requested by WHO. Based on this new research, WHO advises that fabric masks should consist of at least 3 layers of different material. Details of which materials we... okay, so in any case, the point is, the World Health Organization was not advising that the general public should wear a mask back early in the pandemic. And it had nothing to do with just simply lying to the public because there was a shortage of masks for healthcare workers. That was their opinion based on the evidence that they had at the time. Okay, let's look at some other folks. Regarding asymptomatic transmission, which is something that I believe Jimmy Dore, for example, claims that Fauci lied about, that he knew that there was widespread asymptomatic transmission of COVID and lied about it to people. The emails proved that he knew about it and was lying about it. Well, Jimmy's missing, and other people who have commented to this effect in progressive media are missing a subtlety here. They're actually very early on in the pandemic, as in this column dated February 4th, 2020, in Scientist magazine. It was not known for sure early on in the pandemic that there was asymptomatic transmission. So this was a report of asymptomatic transmission of COVID from a woman who came from China to Germany, and supposedly transmitted it before she had symptoms herself. And it turned out she did in fact have symptoms. Actually, the New England Journal of Medicine had to retract, a publication based on this, because it turned out that they didn't have accurate information from the woman. Oh, that's not what I want. Sorry. Okay, so here's an article dated March 2nd. Said the CDC said last month it doesn't recommend people use face masks, making the announcement on the same day that the first case of person-to-person transmission. Sorry, that's not really what I wanted to show you. Let's see. WHO stands by recommendation to not wear masks if you are not sick or not caring for someone who's sick. Okay. Sorry, I'm not finding what I was looking for. Okay, so the distinction that Jimmy Dore and some others missed was that, yes, Fauci and the others were aware of asymptomatic transmission, but they didn't know how prevalent it was. They thought that there wasn't very much of that. In an email on February 25th that Jimmy mentioned in his show about this, Fauci said that the number of COVID infections was probably being underestimated because there were infections by asymptomatic people, but they didn't know how many asymptomatic cases. So on March 1st, Fauci said in an email, people can transmit even when they're asymptomatic, but this isn't the email I was looking for, and I don't have time to find it right now. But and I'll have to put a link to this or copy the text or something in the description. But there's another email where he said that we know there's asymptomatic transmission, but we don't believe that that's a major route by which transmission is occurring. And then, he later changed his mind because, evidence emerged that asymptomatic transmission was common. Okay. All right. I guess there's not really anything new I wanted to show you, but so yeah. Again, the point I want to make here is that you know, there were a lot of scientists, doctors, public health officials, who generally are scientists or doctors, who were saying early on during the pandemic, no, we don't think that masks other than N95 masks are very protective. We know there's asymptomatic transmission, but we don't think it's all that common. And we think that since there's not widespread community prevalence of COVID right now, we don't think that the general public wearing masks, especially if they're not N95s, which we want to preserve for healthcare workers because they're the ones most frequently and directly exposed to COVID, to known or suspected cases of COVID. We want to preserve the N95s for them, but for a variety of reasons that had nothing to do with trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes. They weren't recommending that the general public wear masks early on during the pandemic. And then they later changed their mind as evidence came along that masks were actually very helpful, even if they were not super high quality masks, in both protecting the wearer and protecting others. They didn't know that at first. I presented some of this evidence in a couple of earlier episodes, which I'll refer you back to. The masks, even if they're fabric or cloth masks or whatever, can be quite helpful in slowing down community transmission of COVID. But Fauci and the World Health Organization and the CDC and so on and so forth, you didn't know that back in January, February, March. And then, come April, they changed their guidance the CDC did and Fauci did, the World Health Organization soon thereafter changed their guidance and recommended that the general public wear masks once they had more evidence in that regard. Regarding Fauci's emails, or mostly it was emails that he received from others regarding where COVID came from, there's no evidence whatsoever in any of those emails or anything else that we're aware of that there was a significant group of scientists who thought that the most likely origin of COVID was a leak from a lab or a genetically engineered virus or whatnot. Nobody ever, other than a small minority perhaps of the relevant scientists, thought that that was the most likely origin. As I'll discuss with you in a upcoming episode, all along scientists thought and gathered evidence to support the idea that even though we still don't know for sure, a jump from animals to humans is the most likely way that we got a COVID pandemic. Okay, so I hope you've gotten something out of this episode. It's we really do need to not just look at things on a surface level, but you really need to dig deep to find out the truth, to find subtleties that we may have missed upon more superficial examination. So I hope that left and independent media commentators will do a better job of this going forward. All right, well, that's all I have for you today. Stay tuned for our next episode of The Bitter Pill. Bye, everybody.